As North Korea's nuclear threat has grown, more people in South Korea have argued that the country needs its own nuclear weapons. The idea is that only nuclear weapons can deter nuclear weapons, so South Korea should use its right of self-defense to build them, and that this is the best way to counter the North's nukes. But South Korea getting its own nuclear weapons is really just another wishful thinking. South Koreans have talked about this idea since the 1990s, when North Korea's nuclear program first became widely known, yet there has been absolutely no real progress. That alone shows how unrealistic the idea is. At the most basic level, South Korea doesn't have the materials needed to make nuclear weapons. No plutonium-239, no highly enriched uranium, HEU-235, and no facilities to produce them. Just like you can't bake bread without flour, you can't build nuclear weapons without nuclear material. South Korea does have 24 nuclear power plants and a large amount of spent fuel, but it has no plant to reprocess that fuel. South Korea also promised the U.S. it would not reprocess nuclear material, and it relies on U.S. approval to get fuel for its power plants. Unlike North Korea, South Korea has no uranium mines and no uranium enrichment facilities. South Korea could technically withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, since the treaty allows withdrawal, but doing so would bring heavy international sanctions and would likely destroy the U.S.-South Korea alliance. Without America's nuclear umbrella, South Korea would have no way to deter North Korea's nuclear threats during the many years it would take to build its own bombs. So why does the unrealistic idea of nuclear armament keep coming up in South Korea? First, many politicians and intellectuals prefer a simple fix like nuclear weapons instead of the hard, complicated work required to strengthen systems like the three axes, kill chain, KAMD, and KMPR. Second, talking about self-reliant nuclear weapons is an easy way to appeal to nationalist sentiment and boost popularity. Third, some use the threat of nuclear armament as a way to pressure the United States into strengthening its nuclear umbrella. Fourth, some South Koreans, scholars and ordinary citizens alike, tend to fixate on what they think ought to happen, normative arguments, regardless of whether it's realistic. Some people talk about secretly building nuclear weapons, but that's completely impossible. Because South Korea depends on the U.S. for reactor fuel, it can't secretly divert uranium. Also, after decades of South Koreans' debate about nuclear armament, both the U.S. and the UN watch South Korea very closely. In the early 2000s, when a few South Korean scientists experimented with tiny amounts of uranium enrichment, the IAEA detected it, launched an intense investigation, and South Korea nearly faced sanctions. The biggest problem with South Korea's nuclear armament movement is that it actually weakens South Korea's nuclear deterrence. Nuclear armament advocates say, once we have our own nukes, everything will be fine, and therefore they downplay the need to strengthen the three-axis system or other deterrence measures. So every time North Korea escalates, South Korea spends a few weeks shouting about nuclear armament instead of actually upgrading its defenses. As a result, North Korea's nuclear threat has grown dramatically, but South Korea's practical defenses and deterrence capabilities have barely improved. If South Korea ever got close to actually building nuclear weapons, North Korea would likely launch a preventive attack. A successful South Korean nuclear program would destroy North Korea's nuclear monopoly, and because South Korea's economy is much larger, its nuclear capability would quickly surpass the North's. So if North Korea believed South Korea was about to become a nuclear state, it might launch a full-scale preventive war, or at least a strike against South Korean nuclear facilities. South Korea could end up being attacked before it ever produced a bomb. Polls often show more than 70% of South Koreans supporting nuclear armament, but that's only when the question is asked in the simplest way. When respondents are told about the real consequences, sanctions, the collapse of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, support drops to around the half level of the 70%. Support among progressives is about 20% lower than among conservatives, meaning any attempt to pursue nuclear weapons would face fierce political opposition inside the country. As we've seen in the cases of Pakistan and North Korea, nuclear armament requires extremely strong and unwavering political will. Pakistani leaders famously said they would eat grass if that's what it took to get nuclear weapons. North Korean leaders endured decades of sanctions without giving up. South Korean leaders simply do not have that kind of long-term, unified determination. Even if one president pushed for nuclear weapons, he would be out of office in 5 years, and there's almost no chance the next administration, given South Korea's polarized politics, would continue the program. Some South Koreans push nuclear armament as a way to stir up anti-American sentiment. They know it's unrealistic, but they still tell the public, "We could build nukes if only the US weren't stopping us," hoping to turn people against the US. There is also a revealing contrast with Japan. Japanese leaders rarely talk about building nuclear weapons, and partly because of that restraint, the US has allowed Japan to reprocess spent fuel rods and to enrich uranium. South Korean leaders, by loudly pushing nuclear armament, have been denied similar flexibility. In strategic thinking, Japan's leaders have been far more effective. South Koreans need to recognize that although calls for nuclear armament may come from patriotic motives, the result may actually be the opposite, weakening South Koreans' ability to respond to North Korea's nuclear threat. For more analysis on this topic, see Chapter 6 of the author's book, Nuclear North Korea: Armed, Desperate, and Unpredictable. If you'd like to hear more related content, please click the subscribe button.